Welcome, curious minds. Today we're embarking on a deep dive into some really dramatic visions of our future. We're going to examine the very foundations of human progress, what drives them, and the profound challenges that threaten to turn our path forward into what one of our sources chillingly calls a nightmare on an apocalyptic scale. We've got a pretty fascinating stack of sources to explore today. We'll unpack the insights of Vaclav Smil's How the World Really Works, which really lays bare our deep, often hidden dependencies. Then we'll turn to Peter Zeihan's The End of the World is Just the Beginning. Now, that one offers a really stark vision of global collapse, driven by demographics and geopolitics. And finally, we'll pivot to a bold, almost radical proposal from a paper titled Rethink Progress. This presents an alternative that feels a bit like science fiction, honestly, but it might just be the kind of drastic measure required for these drastic times. Our mission today is to try and connect these seemingly disparate views to show you how close we might be to a critical inflection point, and to explore a world where independent, self-sufficient communities are not just like an ideal, but maybe an absolute necessity for survival. Get ready for some profound insights that might just shift your perspective a bit. When I first started digging into Smil's work, what really struck me was how much of our modern world just feels like magic, which is to expect things to work, right? The lights come on, water flows, stuff appears on shelves. We rarely stop to think about the incredible, often invisible systems underpinning it all. Smil calls this the atomization of knowledge. He argues that while modern science has allowed us to dive incredibly deep into these really narrow fields, it's also led to a kind of fragmented understanding of the whole picture. Like, he gives the example, an expert in particle physics would likely struggle to even understand the first page of a new research paper in viral immunology.
Right, they're completely different worlds, essentially.
Exactly. And this extreme specialization means that public decision-making, especially on these huge, complex, interconnected issues like climate or global supply chains, becomes incredibly difficult. Because few, if any, individuals possess a truly comprehensive grasp of how all these systems actually interact. Like, we're all brilliant specialists, but no one sees the full orchestra, Smil really highlights how we constantly interact with what he calls black boxes. These are systems where we understand the input, maybe, and the output, but not the intricate processes happening inside.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
Think about your mobile phone, for instance. You type a simple query, right? And information appears almost instantly from across the globe. But do you really comprehend how that device processes the data? Or how those optical fiber networks span continents? Or how the vast server farms that power it all consume just staggering amounts of electricity and water?
Yeah, not really. Not the details, anyway.
Or consider something like vaccination, a huge global effort recently. For most people, simply rolling up a sleeve and getting a shot is the only comprehensible part. The decades of biochemical research, the complex manufacturing, the global logistics of cold chains, all of that just remains a mystery, safely tucked away inside that black box. This growing comprehension deficit, where our knowledge becomes increasingly specialized, means we can develop incredible technologies, sure. But our general understanding, even our basic awareness of what truly underpins our modern lives, becomes increasingly shallow.
We're benefiting from systems we barely understand.
Exactly, which makes us vulnerable when they falter.
And this leads us directly to perhaps the biggest black box of all, the unseen engine that fundamentally powers our modern world, something many of us just routinely take for granted: energy, specifically fossil fuels. It's critical to see the connection here because our entire way of life, from the food we eat to the devices we use, is built upon this foundation.
Right. It's almost invisible until it's not there.
Precisely. And consider the sheer scale of the historical shift Smil outlines. In 1850, coal, the dominant industrial fuel back then, supplied no more than 7% of all fuel energy globally. Think about that. Only 7%.
Wow. So what powered everything else?
Well, contrast that with manual labor. Nearly half of all useful kinetic energy still came from draft animals, horses, oxen. About 40% came from human muscles, and just 15% came from inanimate sources like water wheels and the slowly spreading steam engines.
So mostly muscle power, really.
Yeah. The world of 1850, in terms of its energy architecture, was much more akin to the world of 1600 than the year 2000. It was a world primarily powered by biology and basic mechanics. But then, by 1900, the energy landscape had undergone this dramatic transformation. Modern energy sources, primarily coal and crude oil, provided half of all primary energy, while traditional fuels like wood and charcoal accounted for the other half. A huge shift in just 50 years.
Okay, so that's the turn of the 20th century. What about now? Or recently?
Well, fast forward to 2020. Even with the introduction of new renewables like hydropower back in the 1880s and later geothermal, nuclear, solar, and wind, even with all that, over half of the world's electricity was still generated by the combustion of fossil fuels, mainly coal and natural gas.
Still over half.
Yep.
After all this talk about renewables.
Still over half globally, yeah. This increasing and sustained dependence on fossil fuels is, according to Smil, the single most important factor explaining modern civilization's unprecedented advances. He notes a nearly 40-fold gain in useful energy during the 20th century alone.
40-fold?
40-fold. And an astonishing 3,500-fold gain since 1800. That's thanks to both increased fuel consumption and dramatic improvements in conversion efficiencies.
Right.
Think about that for a second. That's not just a technological leap. It's a fundamental redefinition of human capability.
It's hard to even wrap your head around that number.
It means the average person today has access to the energy equivalent of thousands of manual laborers working tirelessly around the clock.
Exactly. It's almost impossible to truly grasp the scale of that freedom, that leverage it's given us. We've gone from a world where everything was muscle and wind to one where we just flip a switch and command the power of a small army. And that in itself is a fragile miracle, as you said. The reliance on fossil fuels, and by extension electricity, is absolute. Smil warns us. Without electricity, city drinking water would be unavailable. Those powerful electric pumps that feed water into municipal supplies would just cease to function.
Right, no power, no water pressure.
Similarly, liquid and gaseous fossil fuels everywhere would be inaccessible. Think fuel pumps for gasoline, kerosene, diesel, electric motors for forced air heating fans. All depend on electricity. A prolonged nationwide electricity failure, he grimly concludes, would be a catastrophic event with unprecedented consequences.
It's not just about convenience, it's the very backbone of our essential services.
Absolutely. The hidden infrastructure of daily life.
Yeah.
Now here's where it gets even more deeply entrenched, maybe even more concerning. It's not just our energy that relies on fossil fuels. It's the very stuff our modern world is made of.
Ah, the material pillars?
Exactly. Smile identifies 4 indispensable material pillars that underpin virtually everything around us. Steel, ammonia, cement, and plastics, the common thread among all of them. Their mass-scale production depends heavily on the combustion of fossil fuels.
And not just for heat, right?
Right. And for some, like ammonia and plastics, these fuels also serve as critical feedstocks, meaning they are the fundamental raw ingredients themselves. Let's delve into these materials a bit, starting with ammonia. Its synthesis, primarily through the incredibly energy-intensive Haber-Bosch process, was a 20th century breakthrough, absolutely essential to feed the rapidly growing populations of industrializing countries.
Right, without synthetic fertilizer, the population boom wouldn't have been possible.
For sure. Think about the scale of population growth. Europe and North America saw an explosion from 300 million to 500 million people just between 1850 and 1900. Largely sustained by this new agricultural productivity. Today, about 150 megatons of ammonia are synthesized annually, with a massive 80% used as fertilizer.
And there are inefficiencies there too, right? Not all that nitrogen gets used by the plants.
Exactly. The challenge is that a significant amount of nitrogen is naturally lost in fields through processes like volatilization, leaching into waterways, denitrification. While solutions exist, like expensive slow-release compounds or precision farming, they aren't widely adopted due to cost and complexity.
So what's the alternative?
Well, Smell notes a key indirect measure to reduce demand, not popular, he says, but highly effective, would be decreased meat consumption in affluent countries.
Ah, because so much grain goes to animal feed.
Precisely. Most grain harvests are actually destined for animal feed, which is a highly inefficient conversion of plant to animal protein. Then there are plastics, derived directly from crude oil and natural gas. These materials combine incredibly useful properties.
Like being light but strong.
Exactly. Low specific gravity, meaning they're incredibly light for their volume alongside high hardness, making them exceptionally durable. This combination makes them invaluable for everything from lightweight packaging, which reduces shipping costs and fuel consumption, to high-performance insulation that saves energy, to sterile medical tubing, crucial for healthcare. In clothes, carpets, everything. And a vast array of synthetic fibers, yeah. By the end of the 20th century, 50 different kinds of plastics were on the global market.
Yeah.
It shows just how pervasive and essential they've become, fundamentally reshaping how we package, build, interact with our world. Steel is another truly fundamental material. Carbon steels, for instance, are ubiquitous, found in everything from, colossal bridges spanning rivers to the humble fridge in your kitchen and the precision gears in a complex machine.
And we make a lot of it.
A huge amount. Primary steelmaking still overwhelmingly dominates the market. It produces more than twice as much hot metal annually, nearly 1.3 billion tons in 2019, as is recycled.
And that primary process needs coal, right? Not just for heat.
Critically, this process begins in massive blast furnaces, which require coke, a product made directly from coal. It's not just about heat. It's about the chemistry, the carbon being integrated into the steel itself to give it its strength and properties. From the blast furnace, the process moves to basic oxygen furnaces. There's no easy, widely adopted, clean alternative for that foundational process right now. That's a massive hurdle for true decarbonization. Finally, let's talk about cement. This is the material that literally makes our modern cities possible. The bedrock of skyscrapers, roads, vast urban infrastructures.
Concrete, basically.
Yeah, concrete made from cement. While concrete is excellent in compression, it can withstand immense downward pressure. It's remarkably weak in tension. It cracks easily when pulled or bent.
Which is why we need rebar, steel reinforcement.
Exactly. That inherent vulnerability meant that its widespread adoption in construction only became feasible after the breakthrough of steel reinforcement, famously demonstrated in '84 with Ernest Ransom's innovative use of steel bars within concrete.
And the scale of cement use is just enormous now.
Astronomical. Annual American cement consumption peaked at 128 million tons, but China's output in 2019 was a staggering 2.2 billion tons.
2.2 billion tons.
Yeah, over half the global total. It highlights the immense scale of its use and its inherent reliance on fossil fuels for the energy-intensive process of clinker production.
So bringing this all together, Smil's analysis really hits home when we consider the illusion of rapid decarbonization. Despite widespread calls, international agreements, ambitious targets urging rapid decarbonization, the reality of transitioning our global energy supply away from fossil fuels is proceeding at a remarkably slow pace.
I feel so slow.
And it's not for lack of resources, mind you. There's no imminent danger of running out of fossil fuels. At 2020 production levels, coal reserves would last for about 120 years, oil and gas for about 50 years. And continued exploration will likely extend those figures.
So it's not about scarcity of the fuels themselves.
Not immediately, no. The stated goal for many is to reduce net global CO2 emissions to zero by 2050, to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees C. But the path to get there is just fraught with challenges. The track record tells a strikingly different story. Take Germany, for example. After 2 decades of its ambitious Energiewende, their big energy transition plan.
Yeah, they've poured a lot into that.
They have, but its fossil fuel share in primary energy supply declined only marginally, from 84% to 78%.
Only that much. Wow.
Yeah. Japan's share actually rose from 83% to 90% after the Fukushima disaster, needing more fossil fuels to compensate for lost nuclear generation. The U.S. was still 80% fossil fuels in 2019, even China, while reducing its share of primary energy from fossil fuels from 93% down to 85%.
That sounds like progress.
But it actually tripled its fossil fuel demand in absolute terms during the first 2 decades of the 21st century.
Tripled. So the percentage went down, but the total amount went way up.
Way up. This massive increase in demand meant that global fossil fuel consumption rose by 45% in that period. And the world's primary energy supply overall only marginally fell from 87% fossil to 84% fossil.
So globally, we've barely moved the needle.
Barely. The scale of the challenge is truly immense, far beyond what many perceive. And Smil emphasizes that we have no readily deployable commercial-scale alternatives for energizing the mass production of those 4 essential material pillars: steel, ammonia, cement, and plastics, solely by electricity.
Meaning even if we had unlimited clean electricity.
We'd still need entirely new, complex, large-scale industrial processes to make those materials without fossil fuels, and they simply don't exist at the scale required today. It's a fundamental chemistry and engineering problem, not just an energy source problem. He directly challenges ambitious claims. He notes that cutting per capita energy demand by half in 3 decades would be an astonishing accomplishment, especially given the 20% global rise in energy demand in the previous 30 years.
Right. Cutting demand is incredibly hard when the trend is going the other way.
Exactly. Forecasts like 100% wind, water, solar by 2030 are labeled by Smela as quantitative fables,
Huh?
amplified by media and celebrities perhaps, but lacking realistic implementation plans and ignoring fundamental material science and energy physics.
So wishful thinking, basically.
That's his assessment. And the latest Global Production Gap report shows that major fossil energy consumers are actually planning to produce 120% more fuels by 2030 than what's consistent with that 1.5 degree C warming limit.
More, not less.
120% more. Smell concludes that any sufficiently effective steps will be decidedly non-magical, gradual, and costly, requiring a level of global resolve and coordinated effort that has, well, thus far been conspicuously lacking.
It paints a picture of systemic inertia that is just incredibly hard to overcome, leaving our civilization profoundly dependent on a finite, climate-altering resource. Okay, so Smela paints this picture of deep, deep fossil fuel dependence and a, frankly, painfully slow energy transition.
Inertia is the word.
Yeah. And then Peter Zeihan delivers this stark, almost apocalyptic vision of why that very system and so much else is potentially on the precipice of breaking apart. Zeihan argues that the entire post-World War II global economic structure, the one facilitated primarily by the American-led order, was fundamentally artificial and transitory.
Not a natural state of affairs, basically.
Not at all. He says it wasn't a natural evolution of global forces, but a deliberate temporary construct designed for a specific historical moment, defeating the Soviets, essentially. The U.S. used its unparalleled Navy to patrol the global oceans, guaranteeing the safety of maritime commerce for all nations, friend or foe.
Which was unprecedented. Usually, navies protect their own trade.
Exactly. Then the U.S. opened its massive market, the only one of significant size after the war, to Allied exports. This allowed devastated countries in Europe and Asia to rebuild their economies through trade, basically letting them sell their way back to prosperity. And crucially, America also extended a strategic blanket, a protective security guarantee over its allies. This prevented invasion and allowed them to dramatically reduce defense spending and focus almost entirely on economic development.
So America paid for the security and provided the market.
Pretty much. This created an unprecedented environment where countries could focus on what they did best, specialize in just a few industries, and import essential resources like food from half a world away, unshackled by the traditional constraints of geography.
You didn't need to be self-sufficient anymore.
Right. This artificial stability massively accelerated industrialization for countries like Canada, Japan, Korea, Italy, Argentina, enabling them to achieve it in just 2.5 generations compared to, say, Britain's 7 centuries-long process.
A huge compression of history.
Absolutely. Spain, Portugal, Greece managed it in just 2 generations. Then, post-Cold War, this order expanded even further, bringing in former neutrals and Soviet bloc countries, creating the hyper-globalized world we know today. A key feature of this order, according to Zeihan, was the effective removal of geographic constraints on material access. Anyone could access anything at any time, allowing for the hyper-specialization and incredibly complex interconnected supply chains that define our modern world.
But the implication is, what happens when that artificial order begins to fray? Or when the U.S. decides it's not worth the cost anymore?
Precisely. And that leads right into his core argument.
This raises an important, deeply unsettling question. What's the fundamental driver behind this predicted collapse, according to Zeihan? He argues that the world's demographic structure passed the point of no return 20 to 40 years ago, and that the 2020s are the decade when it all breaks apart.
Past the point of no return.
Yeah.
That sounds final.
It's a very strong claim. He argues this isn't a slow, distant problem for our grandchildren. It's unfolding right now with irreversible momentum. And he provides a truly shocking statistic. In 2019, for the first time in recorded history, the Earth had more people aged 65 and over than 5 and under.
More people over 65 than under 5.
Wow. Think about that. More people nearing the end of their working lives, becoming net consumers of resources and healthcare, than children entering schools who represent future workers and taxpayers. By 2030, just around the corner, he projects there will be twice as many retirees, in relative terms, as there are children entering the workforce.
That's a massive shift in the balance.
It represents an unprecedented inversion of the global population pyramid, a demographic cliff that he believes will have cascading economic and social consequences.
Okay, so what are those consequences, according to him?
Well, this demographic inversion leads to dire economic and social implications, regardless of political ideology. Zeihan states that capitalism without growth generates massive inequality. We saw that, he argues, in the United States during the Great Depression, or maybe reflected in the rise of Donald Trump in the Rust Belt as a reaction to deindustrialization and declining opportunities, or even the societal collapse seen in the Lebanese Civil War.
So when the pie stops growing.
Those with wealth and connections simply manipulate the system to grab larger shares of that shrinking pie, which leads to social explosions, unrest, radicalization. The future of socialism, he contends, is even darker. While it might preserve economic equality, socialism struggles to generate the same levels of growth as capitalism even when the pie is expanding, let alone when it's shrinking.
So everyone just gets poorer together.
Pretty much. Everyone would become noticeably worse off every year, making mass uprisings and state fracture almost inevitable in his view. Even more authoritarian systems like fascist corporatism or command-driven communism, while offering quiet political systems by crushing dissent, would still face similar problems of stagnation or soul-crushing dictatorships due to the fundamental lack of growth and diminishing resources.
So no system really escapes this demographic trap.
That's his argument. In this accelerating demographic collapse, Zihan concludes, there are no countries who boast the mix of youth and reach necessary to project power out of their own neighborhood on a cost-effective, sustained basis. The very ability to maintain that global order, the one the U.S. built to patrol the seas, enforce peace, is eroding from within, not just for the U.S., but for any potential successor. There's just not enough young, productive people to support it.
That's a profoundly sobering thought. That the very foundations of global stability are crumbling not just from external pressures, but from an internal demographic implosion. This brings us to a stark thought experiment Zihan poses. Imagine your hometown. What if everything it needed, manufactured goods, food, energy it had to provide entirely itself?
Yeah, that's a tough thought. Impossible for most places.
Right. Even for immense, highly specialized global cities like Shanghai, Tokyo, or London, he says, it would be impossible for you to live your current life. We become this single-town system where we all specialize in what we're good at, picking avocados in Mexico, cutting metal in Germany, wiring wind turbines in China, and then we trade globally for everything else.
The hyper-specialization we rely on.
Exactly. Zihan is unequivocal. This system will fracture into some very non-integrated pieces. The very first casualty in this scenario is long-haul transport. Why? Because it requires absolute peace in all regions, a condition that Zihan emphatically states won't exist in the fractured world that emerges from this demographic shift and the U.S. potentially pulling back.
No global policemen, basically.
Right. This directly impacts 3/4 of all energy, manufacturing, and agricultural shipments. Imagine thousands of container ships, the lifeblood of global trade, just sitting idle because the oceans are no longer safe, or the goods they carry are simply too expensive to move without that security guarantee.
The whole JIT just-in-time system breaks down.
Completely. Modern megaports, designed as these massive transit and distribution hubs for megaships carrying thousands of containers, they won't function anymore. It'll necessitate a return to more smaller ports closer to consumption points.
Which sounds incredibly inefficient.
He estimates it will, at minimum, quadruple transport costs and fundamentally alter trade routes. Reverting back decades, maybe centuries, in terms of trade efficiency, the implications of this fracturing are just huge and far-reaching. Take China, for example. Its demographic collapse. The one-child policy catching up means its labor costs have gone up by a factor of 15 since 2000.
15 times.
15 times. Rapidly eroding its competitive advantage as a low-cost manufacturer. Zihan sees China being reshaped as the king of the low end and the emperor of assembly, maybe capable of producing basic goods but pushing higher-end manufacturing elsewhere. This will lead to the erosion of Asia's chokehold on electronics, fundamentally changing the global tech landscape.
So where does that high-end stuff go?
Well, Zihan specifically notes that semiconductor fabrication facilities, chip fabs, absolutely critical for all electronics, will have little choice but to come to the United States.
Why the U.S. specifically?
Because they need highly skilled workers, rock-solid electricity reliability, remember Smill's point, and robust manufacturing support systems, things he argues will be increasingly scarce elsewhere. While the U.S., with its diverse geography, significant military, and comparatively better demographics, is seen as maybe a harbor in the storm, capable of regional self-sufficiency.
But not the rest of the world.
Zihan states for most of the world, it will never get better than it was in the 2010s. Never. That's a direct quote.
It's a bleep.
It is. Capital flight from aging economies like Russia, China, Korea, Japan, Germany, as populations retire en masse and tax bases shrink, will necessitate stringent capital controls. This further fragments the global economy and severely limits foreign investment. This isn't just an economic recession he's describing, it's a fundamental rewiring of the global operating system, a deglobalization on a scale we haven't seen.
That's a chilling picture. And what truly strikes me is how interconnected everything is. The collapse of the global order, driven by these demographic shifts, has immediate and devastating implications for our most basic needs: energy and food.
Right, the essentials.
When it comes to energy, as Smil highlighted, oil's inherent power allowed us for decades to ignore geography itself, bringing energy from anywhere to anywhere, fueling our industrial and urban revolutions. But Zehan warns this era is ending. The physical concentrations of urbanization, he states, are simply not possible without ample energy. Big cities need constant, massive energy inputs.
Makes sense.
In a deglobalized world, transport links will shrivel. This directly impacts the coherence of manufacturing supply chains and, critically, food distribution. Many electricity systems will simply fail due to lack of imported fuel, often, plunging large urban centers into darkness, not for hours, but potentially for weeks or months.
That sounds like societal breakdown territory.
It does, and he highlights the severe limitations of green tech as a quick fix for this looming energy crisis, really echoing Smil's caution. Solar power, despite significant investment and impressive growth rates, only increased to 1.5% of total global energy use between 2014 and 2020.
Still tiny in the grand scheme.
Tiny. A full switch over to green energy for the roughly 43,000 terawatt-hours of electricity the world uses, which is about 70 times the total green technology build-out from 2010 through 2021, is beyond Herculean. The technical challenges, material sourcing, the sheer cost, it's astronomical.
And what about EVs, electric vehicles?
He points out that electric vehicles, often seen as a panacea, would actually require doubling down on the very energy sources that environmentalists say we're trying to cut out.
How so?
Because of the energy intensity in mining the lithium, cobalt, nickel, processing them, manufacturing the batteries and the cars themselves, it takes a lot of energy, mostly fossil fuel energy right now. And crucially, Smil and Zehan agree on this point. There is neither an existing technology nor an imminent technological revolution that can replace oil and natural gas in the agricultural sector.
That's a big one. No replacement for diesel tractors or synthetic fertilizers.
Not at scale, not anytime soon, according to them. This is a stark truth often overlooked in energy transition discussions. And that brings us to food, where Zehan's predictions are particularly dire. He forecasts in excess of 1 billion people will starve to death, and another 2 billion will suffer chronic malnutrition as a direct consequence of this deglobalization.
1 billion starving. That's almost unbelievable.
It's a shocking number. He explicitly states that 2/3 of China's population faces one of those two fates due to their reliance on imported food, energy, and fertilizer inputs. This is because modern industrial agriculture is just deeply reliant on oil-derived products for everything. Machinery like tractors and combines, the transport that moves crops from fields to processing plants and then to markets.
And the fertilizer, back to ammonia.
And, most critically, the artificial fertilizers produced using the energy-intensive Haber-Bosch process Smil discussed. Without the current global system facilitating these long, complex supply chains, the entire model collapses. Specialized crop production like wheat from the American Great Plains, corn and soy from Argentina, Brazil, the U.S. becomes incredibly vulnerable to transport disruptions and regional conflicts.
We saw a hint of that with Ukraine, didn't we?
Exactly. He points to the 2022 Ukraine war as a preview of the food shortages of the future, noting the country's inability to afford mechanization and its thin energy capacity under wartime conditions, which significantly disrupted global food markets, even though only one major supplier was partially offline. Imagine multiple disruptions. Climate change further exacerbates this, causing uneven heating globally, turning deserts hotter and drier, making flatter tropical zones into unproductive wetlands potentially. Water management in places like Mexico, China, and North Korea will face significant challenges, leading to catastrophic floods and reduced harvests.
So a perfect storm, really. Deglobalization, energy scarcity, climate change.
Yeah. Zehan starkly concludes, the end of globalization may herald the end of the world we know, but the end of global energy heralds the end of the lives we know. It's a chilling, interconnected web of vulnerabilities that he lays out.
Okay, so we've just painted a pretty dramatic picture, haven't we?
Yeah. Dramatic is one word for it. Maybe terrifying is another.
Right. A world unraveling, facing these massive disruptions to energy, food, stability, all driven by our deep fossil fuel dependencies, as Smales showed, and these seemingly irreversible demographic shifts that Zehan highlights. It's a truly sobering assessment of the fragility of the systems we often take for granted.
It really makes you question the trajectory we're on.
Exactly. But what if? What if our very perception of progress, of how we plan our future, needs to be radically reconsidered? What if the path forward isn't about desperately trying to maintain this crumbling, hyper-globalized system, but about a bold, fundamental shift in how we organize ourselves and secure our basic needs?
Okay, so an alternative path.
Maybe. That's where this Rethink Progress paper comes in. It opens by inviting its authors, and by extension us, the readers, to rethink progress in an age where progress might be turning into a nightmare on an apocalyptic scale.
Pretty direct language.
Very direct. It suggests that our current ways of planning and ordering the world need to deviate so much from our existing mental models that it might seem like sci-fi futurism, but when in reality it's simply about implementing drastic measures for drastic times.
So necessity being the mother of invention, perhaps.
Perhaps. The paper deeply challenges the 19th century Machiavellian and Darwinian fixation on fear and death as the primary power of progress. It argues that this perspective underplays the core reality of life and abundance that should be the ultimate objective of all conscious cooperation.
So shifting focus from survival at all costs to enabling flourishing.
Kind of. It pushes back against the common narrative in stories, featuring shallow heroes only able to save a single personal love relationship, almost like a single organism just saving itself. Instead, it envisions a real ecosystem of abundant species of human communities, a multitude of loosely networked yet truly independent entities.
Okay, so less of a single global village and more. A network of strong, distinct villages.
That seems to be the idea. It's a profound shift from the centralized, interconnected, and highly vulnerable global system that Smil and Zehan describe as fracturing. It posits that a fixation on a Hobbesian war of all against all, this constant competition, prevents us from recognizing a more fundamental, cooperative path to abundance that prioritizes the collective well-being of communities.
Interesting. So how do they propose achieving this, especially given the energy and resource constraints we just discussed?
Well, this is precisely where the Rethink Progress proposal offers a fascinating counter-narrative. It presents a solution that directly addresses the fundamental vulnerabilities and impending crises we've discussed. Point 1. It proposes creating a globally networked community of trusted enterprises, which they call the ISCOT. ISCOTs. Okay, what does that stand for? What's its purpose?
They don't fully spell out the acronym in the sections we reviewed, but its sole purpose would be supplying abundant, new generation, clean, and baseload heat and electrical energy.
Okay, let's unpack that. Baseload is key, always on, reliable power.
Exactly. Always on, always available, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Unlike intermittent sources like current solar or wind without massive storage, and it would be proto-commodity energy.
Proto-commodity, what did that?
It means it's so fundamental, so ubiquitous, and so abundant that its market price becomes negligible, almost like, ideally, water or air so essential that it's simply provided, not bought and sold on speculative markets.
Wow. Energy too cheap to meter, essentially, that old dream.
Something like that, but maybe more accurately, energy treated as essential infrastructure, not a speculative good. And this leads to point 2. The proposal's most radical and perhaps most vital step is to get energy supply out of the marketplace entirely.
Take energy out of the market. How would that even work?
Well, the paper argues that current enterprises and economies are plagued by inefficient, scarce, or fossil fuel-based energy supply, and that energy costs burden most economies. It's a constant struggle rather than a foundational given. By removing energy from market speculation, geopolitical conflicts, and profit motives, the ISCOT could focus solely on efficiency and abundance.
So shift the paradigm from energy as a commodity to energy as a public good.
Exactly. Universally protected and isolated from the very market failures and geopolitical games that often cause its scarcity or volatility, the measure of success for this ISCOT isn't profit. It's defined by 2 physical metrics. First, a physical increase in the percentage of the total expected global quantity and reach of supply to communities and their enterprises. And second, an increasing percentage of energy supplied according to the physical theoretical limit of the current optimal baseload energy source being exploited. Whatever the best tech is, maximize its output.
So its only goal is just more and better energy for everyone.
Pretty much. Its singular, unwavering goal is ever-increasing and ever-improving energy supply as its only measure of success. This proposal directly confronts Smill's evidence of slow, market-driven decarbonization and Zihan's looming energy scarcity by proposing a dedicated, unmarket-driven energy solution, prioritizing global energy abundance as a universally accessible foundation for all.
That's a truly profound shift, isn't it? Taking energy, this foundational element of modern life that Smill detailed, and moving it outside the market economy, that's a radical idea.
It is. It challenges fundamental assumptions about how economies should work.
But what's fascinating here is how this concept of abundant, demarketized energy could enable that fundamental shift we talked about, allowing those independent, norm-forming communities to actually thrive, even in the kind of fractured world Zihan described.
Right. It provides the means for local resilience.
Let's connect the dots here. If communities have the energy resources necessary to be truly self-sufficient through this ISCOT, well, then they become far less vulnerable to the global supply chain collapses and energy scarcities described by Zihan, right?
You break the dependence on those long, fragile chains.
The need for global long-haul transport diminishes significantly if local needs can be met through localized, abundant energy production. You could power local manufacturing, vertical farms, water purification, things that currently rely on global trade.
It basically re-enables localism, but with advanced technology powered by clean energy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
This directly counters Zihan's chilling warning that current urban life would be impossible without global access to food and manufactured goods. Because cities and rural communities could, theoretically, become self-reliant in energy and, by extension, food and basic manufacturing, using this globally provided energy foundation.
So abundance enables local production.
Abundant, localized energy lets communities produce locally, negating the vulnerabilities of hyper-specialized global supply chains and the geopolitical disruptions that plague them. It means your hometown could actually survive and thrive, not by pulling up the drawbridge and relying solely on its own limited natural resources, like in Zihan's starkest scenario.
But by plugging into this guaranteed energy network.
Right. By accessing a global energy network that guarantees fundamental energy needs without the pitfalls of market volatility or geopolitical leverage. That's a crucial distinction, isn't it? Global cooperation on a foundational level enables local resilience.
Exactly. And when we connect this to the bigger picture, the proposal for universal protection for the ISCOT, shielding it from conflicts and market forces, and a clear focus on what to do with energy, meaning using it to solve human problems rather than constantly struggling with how to create it or fight over its distribution. Well, that's a direct, bold response to the global disorders Zihan predicts.
The freeing up human potential, essentially.
It envisions a world where energy, once secured and abundant through this dedicated network, frees up immense human effort and economic resources to tackle actual human and environmental issues like famines, pollution, resource wars, social upheaval. We would no longer be constantly consumed by the struggle for basic energy or driven by a destructive zero-sum competition for scarce resources, which both Smell and Zihan show is a huge part of our current reality.
Sounds almost utopian, but framed against the alternative.
Well, the authors of Rethink Progress imply that the dramatic visions of the future presented by Smill and Zihan, with their detailed accounts of deep dependencies, agonizingly slow transitions, irreversible demographic decline, and inevitable supply chain fracturing, are precisely why their solution cannot be denied for too long.
Because the status quo is heading towards disaster.
That seems to be the argument. The other sources clearly show how close we might be to this critical inflection point, where such a radical shift, a world that allows independent, norm-forming communities within an ecosystem of, as they say, ever-sanctifying communities, to have the energy resources necessary to be truly self-sufficient, isn't just desirable, but maybe essential for survival.
It's a stark reminder that the current path seems unsustainable.
And that a fundamental reimagining of our energy infrastructure, and indeed our societal organization, is not a luxury, but perhaps a pressing existential necessity. We're facing a choice, maybe, between continuing down a path of increasing fragility or taking a truly disruptive leap towards foundational security. Hashtag tag tag outro.
So we've taken quite a deep dive today, haven't we, into the profound challenges facing human progress. From the atomization of knowledge and our deep, often hidden fossil fuel dependence, as Vaclav Smil so clearly showed us, to the impending collapse of globalization, the demographic cliff, and a frankly terrifying future of fractured supply chains and widespread food insecurity, as painted by Peter Zihan.
It's a sobering look at the inherent fragility of the systems we often take for granted. a lot to process. And against that dramatic, almost apocalyptic backdrop, we've explored the radical proposal from Rethink Progress, advocating for this global network, the ISCOT, dedicated to abundant, clean, and market-isolated energy. This vision isn't just about technological shifts like building more solar panels or reactors, although that's part of it. It's about fundamentally restructuring how societies operate to ensure essential needs are met at a local, self-sufficient level.
Directly countering the vulnerabilities.
Exactly, directly countering the vulnerabilities and existential threats laid bare by Smil and Zihan. It's presented almost as the necessary antidote.
Smil concludes his book by stating something quite profound. Asking for a risk-free existence is to ask for something quite impossible, while the quest for minimizing risks remains the leading motivation of human progress.
That feels very true.
Yeah. And Rethink Progress seems to suggest a world where this quest for minimizing risks focuses not on desperately trying to prop up a crumbling, hyper-globalized system.
But on securing foundational needs starting with energy for independent communities.
Right, through guaranteed clean energy provided outside the market. Is this bold decentralization, this move towards empowered local communities powered by a universally protected energy supply, the true next frontier of progress?
Or is it merely a utopian dream in the face of what seems like insurmountable global inertia, the kind Smil described so well?
That's the big question, isn't it? What stands out to you listening to all this from this deep dive into the foundations and potential future of our world?